3.2%, and the non-oil sector contracted by 3.4%. We share with you quarterly real GDP growth rates from two perspectives, by finding the average over the last 7 years, that is from the first quarter of 2014 to the second quarter of 2020, and look at how that compares with only the second quarter of 2020. From the perspective of oil and non-oil, we see that from both perspectives, as was indicated, restricting the GDP estimate to the second quarter of 2020, we saw that from both perspectives, the economy contracted respectively by 3.2 and 3.4%. Relative to what happened over the last 7 years, that is the first quarter of 2014 to the second quarter of 2020, we saw these two sectors, that is the oil sector growing by 4.6% and the non-oil sector growing by 4.1%. We do the same analysis from the three sectors' point of view by comparing GDP estimates for the last 7 years with GDP estimates for the second quarter of 2020. And with the exception of the agricultural sector that saw an expansion of 2.5%, both the industry sector and the services sector saw a contraction. Specifically, the industry sector saw a contraction of 5.7%, followed by the services sector contracting by 2.6%. Relative to what happened in the previous 7 years, for all three sectors, that is agricultural sector, we saw an expansion of 3.6%, industry sector 6.0%, and services sector 4.1%. We go ahead to share with you, because of the uniqueness of the second quarter 2020 GDP estimates, we share with you sectors that saw an expansion for the second quarter of 2020 and sectors that saw a contraction for the same period, that is the second quarter of 2020. We provide two estimates for your guidance in interpreting these growth rates across sectors that saw an expansion and sectors that saw a contraction. And these estimates are the subsectors' share of total GDP and the growth rate. The subsector that saw the highest expansion is the information and communication subsector. But it is important to realize that the information and communication subsector comes fourth in terms of the share of total GDP. We have the crops subsector that saw the highest growth, having a contribution of 12.0%, followed by construction subsector having a share of 8.5%, and transport and storage following with 6.3%. So although these three sectors have higher relative shares to GDP, they come low in terms of growth rate, and information and communication subsector that saw a growth rate of 74.2% has a share of only 5.9%.
Now joining me via Zoom with more on this development is government statistician Professor Samuel Kobna Enim. Thank you very much, Professor Enim. Now, can you explain to the layman as much as possible what this means when you say the economy has contracted?
Thank you very much. The contraction in the economy should be interpreted from the perspective of the value additions across the various economic activities. So from the agricultural sector point of view, what has been the value addition from an output point of view, and from the industry and services sector, what has been the value addition. So over the period, we've seen growth rates in excess of 0%, but as was rightly indicated in today's release, we see a contraction in the GDP estimates from both an oil and a non-oil perspective. This means that our output levels have reduced. It is important to distinguish between the current prices of our GDP estimates and the constant prices of our GDP estimates. From our current prices point of view, it's influenced by both the effects of prices and output. But because we are interested in the real GDP, that is to measure the extent to which productivity has gone up, we deflate the current prices with the price deflator, and that gives us a sense of how actual goods and services over the period have increased. So what this means is that between quarter 2 2019 and quarter 2 2020, and by 3.2%. And if you do the estimations without taking into consideration the effects of oil, our economy contracted by 3.4%. That is, goods and services, value addition of goods and services have decreased by these respective percentages.
All right, so this, you're saying, this decline in growth, as far as you're concerned, has to do mainly with the COVID-19 pandemic and the way it's impacted the economy.
Indeed, we are able to attribute the contraction to COVID-19 because we did share with the Ghanaian populace the effect of COVID-19 on business activities. And the GDP computation, as I explained earlier on, is largely due to the outputs that we get from our business activities. And here I define business activities in a broader context to include what happens across all the three sectors. And during the release of the Rapid Business Survey, the one focusing on the business sector, one of the highlight stories that we put out was the fact that some businesses had closed down, both as a result of the partial restrictions at the instance of the president and the restrictions that followed even when the restrictions had been lifted. So we saw quite a number of our firms closing down in the month of April, where we realized that there were decreases in sales, especially for the accommodation and food sector, for the manufacturing sector, and for the trading sector. And even in the months of May, June, which is the window within which this 2020 quarter 2 GDP has been estimated, we still had some of our firms close down. So the closures of the firms and the associated dip in sales, as was released during the COVID-19 rapid survey on the business tracker, is clearly the hint that we use as basis to attribute the contraction to the COVID-19 effect.
Now, the impacts of COVID-19, it's felt not only in the second quarter, it's lingering or it lingered into the third quarter. Do we anticipate another decline in economic growth in the third quarter?
I'll be circumspect in indicating that another contraction is going to happen in the third quarter, simply because a number of interventions have been instituted, and it's going to be a play out on how these interventions would mitigate the further effect of COVID-19. But indeed, one would be careful in saying that the 3.2 would not experience a sharp turnaround as we move into the quarter, as we move into the third quarter and the fourth quarter. As you rightly put it, the effect of COVID-19 still lingers on, especially when we have some restrictions still in place and when we had the borders, the international borders still closed down in most part of the third quarter of the year. So we still would have some effect, but the extent of the effect, as in whether it's going to be a contraction or a much marginal increased growth rate, will depend on how the interventions are able to mitigate the effect of COVID-19.
All right. Now, how much of the 3.2 or the negative or the decline, how much of that is going to impact on the annual or the overall growth rate GDP for 2020?
The contraction that we've experienced in the second quarter of 2020 would have to compete with growth rates or otherwise for the first quarter of 2020, as well as the third and fourth quarters of 2020. It will be recalled that in the first quarter of 2020, we recorded an expansion in our economy of 4.9%. And now we've recorded a contraction of 3.2%. So moving into the third and fourth quarters, the outcomes would inform the annual GDP for the year 2020. And again, as was indicated earlier, the prediction of that depends on the extent to which we strongly face the effect of COVID-19 in the next 2 quarters of the year.
All right, thank you very much. That's Government Statistician Professor Samuel Kobna. And in moving on, some depositors of defunct microfinance and savings and loans companies queued up Wednesday at consolidated bank branches to receive the outstanding claims, this time in cash. This was after government released some 3.65 billion cedis to the receiver, Eric Nanenipa, to facilitate the payment. Nicholas Brown has the details.
Depositors of the collapsed microfinance companies, savings and loans and finance houses will from today have full access to their funds. It follows the government's resolution of the original commercial paper, also known as bond. The government yesterday released a total of 3.56 billion Ghana cedis to settle the remaining depositor claims of the 347 defunct microfinance companies, 23 savings and loans and finance houses. Affected customers have been directed to visit any branch of the Consolidated Bank Ghana Limited to receive their money through the new funding arrangement. Today, we are here at the head office of the Consolidated Bank Ghana Limited to ascertain the facts whether or not these customers have been able to